Living the Dream by Kevin Clinton. For you. Chapter 1. Thank you, Janice, Jen began, lump in her throat and tears in her eyes. For everything. We've still got a long way to go, Jen, Janice responded. We'll start with what you did this week. It's how we'll be doing this most other weeks as well. It's just so refreshing to have you on my side, Jen added first, where nobody else would be. Well started, Janice. Certainly you're one of the first cases I've come across so practical about your goals and how to achieve them, and I can tell that you've given it thought and for longer than anyone else that could tell you what to do. Just as long as you remember I'm here to help support you. I really appreciate you understanding, Jen told her. We're both going to have to be a team in this to best and fully understand what I'm trying to explain. There was a pause between them, briefly a few moments of sincerity, where both knew Jen was indeed in that moment of some sort of practically controlled insanity. And she then said something curbed, which even redeemed credit for her the more, which was, one thing at a time is the way best to take it whenever these bizarre sort of things take places with one another. And I found you're very trusting, that you're genuine in your intentions, which may be why I'm trusting my own understandings better. Yes, it is refreshing that you have an open mind about all this, Janice agreed. One thing at a time, and we'll start from this week on when considering what you've told me. Do you think it would be okay for us to continue seeing each other? Jen had just finished 2 full hours in her discussions with Janice, her therapist, the discussion which she'd been practicing over the course of most that year, and just after the anniversary of meeting. She had suffered for quite a long time for the delusion which she couldn't shake that she was the true identity of Janice, which was new upon meeting as it had been with others upon meeting them some of the times. However, when she was finally given the opportunity talking about this common delusion of hers within those therapy sessions, she'd come to the realizations of being able to make a clear decision which healthy and becoming personality she was going to be striving toward, and even eventually surpassing. The one she identified and saw from, which was her own body. She finally realized this with Janice and began giving Janice much more credit immediately. Of course, if Jen indeed was some other body to whom she didn't identify, it's not like she can just take someone else's place and give up her own. She'd been trying with each various stay at different hospitals to be the orderlies, and it hadn't gone very well with any of them. Just the same, nobody liked it when she tried to be somebody else, least of all the people who'd become that somebody at whom she was doing this. She was diagnosed as one sufferer of schizoaffective disorder with delusions of grandeur, and as such she would never have thought to rule out the possibility that Janice or anybody else was indeed only a figment of her imagination to begin with. However, that was never what literally everybody else felt about the matter. So that year she was due for some disgrandeur when things up and just made complete sense. This is the story leading up to and beyond that. Jen had been mulling over the strongest examples the past few weeks more heavily than normal. Those examples which would describe what she felt to Janice and the reasons she believed that their two identities had been somehow intertwined and crossed by a universe she was just now getting the grasp of, an understanding. Whether it was entirely an utter delusion is up to anyone to decide, being that the examples Jen had been describing before to Janice had all initially scared them both with good offense to identities, until they actualized how the thought itself was a core part of the disorder Jen was coming to deal with of mind, and that having a spiritual enthusiasm didn't have to be unhealthy. So Janice played along even so, and Jen had vowed to explain in greater detail the reasons behind such a feeling to Janice. Chapter 2. Jen awoke 1 year prior with a rush of euphoria followed by a rarely calming paralysis of a person still deep within a sleep stage while fully aware of her true surroundings. In the corner of her room, Jen's nightstand perched white with the uncertain glow of either the moonlight through the window or the headlights of an early starter. Upon the nightstand was her shuffled music player, its play having been silenced by its final song sometime early in that morning, or perhaps late the previous night. All was silent, save for the light breeze outside of the window, which had been rustling leaves all dawn, leaves still making up their minds whether the season was of summer's end or of autumn's beginning. Jen's drawn breath was what finally fully woke her, and so she blew an imaginary birthday candle in an imaginary birthday moment. It wasn't her birthday, but that seemed so much what to do, since the dream had filled her with such wishful thoughts. It had really put things into perspective for her, and especially with how rare it is for her to wake up still dreaming so. She had dreamt one of those dreams which displayed something she would never have thought in her waking life, those which are not much more than passing fancies, but rather are flashing, and instead of flashing by, they are one long, altogether collectively strung along design, and they are utterly original in their wholeness. In these sorts of moments one can hardly speak but a soliloquy, and so it began. "What the?" she muttered. "Did that all really just happen?" The final moment of the dream had been one of particular, singular, albeit peaceful applause, which was coupled with more thunderous contentment from its audience doing so, and was the follow-up dream segment to a belching performance Jen was doing on a stage of some sort, curtain and all. The settling of the crowd to her had been apparently planned 2 years in the making. "Where the hell did that come from?" she gasped again, and then finally added to the thought, "Impromptu my ass, that would take some choreography. I mean, I don't just belch like that at the drops of hats, not that well." In quite fact, Jen did belch. She just never made it into any impromptu opening stage performance, or ever, for that matter, even considered it any sort of gift or form of communication in that regard. Belching was disgusting. She would tell you. Her exclamations were hardly overemphasized, as she couldn't help but stress sheer puzzlement that not only were these recent dreams of collective fancy getting more and more lucid leading to that particular finale they all seemed to have, but this time enough was enough. She'd never in her right mind be performing belches to a crowd. Who does that? Jen's earliest dream to memory of such subject was telling off her boyfriend with words she never would have thought up in real life, and preaching that which she would never think to consider about him until after the dream itself, all of which woke her at the very moment the dream had been acknowledged. She wouldn't want to be candid during any of the more vulnerable of sleep stages, which were so deep that not even she could predate their inspirations, let alone folding if she were to ever try and explain them in quite a folly, such as of what to say to her ex-boyfriend, if ever provided the opportunity. Had this one not been the birthday candle type of dream, she would have woken in the night in cold sweat, startled at the idea that she became aware of a dream scale of existence, but mostly, by the time of gaining composure, just thankful to have been alone in her apartment where no one else would see her embarrassing startles. However, because this kind of positive dream was the kind she preferred to tell others over the course of a few stories, rather than shouting out things while still in those stages of waking from sleep, she simply blew the imaginary candle to calm her breaths. She certainly didn't want to be laughed at for the belching either until she knew what it meant, the actual message being what the audience was conveyed to by. The message and true meaning of the act itself being too profound for any awake person to understand anyways. What had followed the speech was a hideous thought even to her, when she began to sing in the dream with her real-life singing voice. "That music," she spoke again, this time more softly. "Was that my own music, or was it from the shuffle?" She glanced toward the playlist display off her shuffle music player on the nightstand, which had gone blank. Sometime before it had stopped. Could it have crept into her dream without her knowing? She wondered how all those dream figures could have been so intently listening to such the horrible voice which came from her on the stage, and then it hit her. "I've got," she began to exclaim, "to write down those words." Chapter 3. Jen tuned the television power with notepapers and pen ready in her hands, After having written the words from her dream onto whatever paper she could find, she sank back into the furniture of her living room and began reading over the scribbled notes. The first advertising promotion from the television had been from some soda playing over the program for what seemed to draw on for hours and hours. It didn't occur to her at this time that she hadn't touched a soda in years, but for some reason the music of the promotion was right along with the music in her head as she wrote the words from that dream performance. And the music had been playing in her head since before she'd even turned on the television, which made it very puzzling to her they'd sync up in any eerie way. The tin percussion, the artificial breeze, the twang of an acoustic guitar, it had all been in her dream, as she now recalled. Then the brass section started into the mix. She glanced up finally from her notes, and quite in bewilderment. Staring at the screen, she waited a full 43 seconds from the beginning of the ad unto the end, before she realized that it had been for some brand of cereal, since the soda ad had ended. It didn't matter to her in the slightest what had been running throughout the promotional ads product-wise anyhow, and it was mainly because for some reason she just knew that the music therein had been the music from her dream. And so, in her state of excitement at such profound foreseeing of the future, to say the least, she skipped over how likely it was that she had previously undergone this particular promotional advertisement experience, and the music was relayed in her dream after having heard the music without really paying mind to it fully yet, even though it was difficult to shake from the idea that it was her own unique and original design. She quickly put it out of her mind that the program could have taken the music straight from her dream, passing it off as it would obviously be delusional to think that far gone. But then the next promotion featured several people belching. It was a slightly different tune from her dream, so she knew that part was at least of its own merit without somehow being intertwined with this programming network's run of commercials. But since the similarities were piling on to her with these things all adding up to the same coincidence right in a row, she considered the idea that maybe she was writing in some setting to which she didn't know she had presided to in the first place. This thought was compounded upon right when she wrote more about the dream, and only 2 times she glanced up. They seemed to be looking back at her in approval for it. She couldn't tell if they were drawing from her in the past or in the present, or if it was even in fact happening all at once in a row. All she knew was that it was all adding up into a piled onto awareness, correlated with the attention she paid. At least that's what it seemed like. Again, the logic of the situation didn't cross her mind. Blocked by her excitement, she never would have admitted the likelihood that these were fairly common ads, and as such were already likely to adjoin anything she'd been doing either. She hardly considered that the makers were being paid professionally to make these such ads appear to be universally applicable by being universally recognizable to the strongest extents they can do so. She glanced at the clock in the kitchen just above the oven to find that over 2 hours had gone by, and the realization that she had only glanced from her notes to the television twice in all that time really hit her. She began to study the television program closely, discovering that she had quite a bit of similarity to the characters, and dousing her mental self in likeness after likeness as she turned each channel, as if she really could do the whole performance thing on stage so easily, simply because they don't all need to appear so glamorously different from herself all the time. She couldn't believe how much the characters of the actual shows, when flipping through the channels, identified with her in very subtle ways too, and nor could she believe how many metaphors were made for dream life itself. Immediately now that she was focusing on that bit, and listening more for it about what was being said by the characters played on each network, she felt she had to match wits with these acting guilds so that she could one day show them all that glitz isn't really all that necessary, merely in order to put entertainments on. If they're being done for and to a truly loyal audience who's listening to what the entertainers had truly had all along to say. It could be just like in her dream, in other words. Of course, if she made it to any big network with such a living leaving, it would all have to be a very real approach from her, and there wouldn't likely be many opportunities for any sort of redos. If it wasn't done right the first time, it would have to be rolled with, also just as within her dream. That's when the thought occurred to her that she wanted to tell somebody, but all the people she could think to tell were at the workplace for her regular hours day job, where she didn't really want people worrying about her, just in case they might. It was going to be time to go into that day job very soon, so she put the thought out of her mind as best she could by working out with some vocal warm-ups and otherwise exercises. Chapter 4. A good hour or so of struggled practice projecting her vocals brought Jen to the curiosity about the midday talk show with Lacey Goldman, so finally setting aside her newly written words along with the words from her dreams, she tuned to the television again. "This girl," Lacey was saying, "who has had no experience ever performing on stage, is here with us tonight to showcase her new talent. What is it that you have to show us, young lady?" "I'm going to sing," the little girl spoke. "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little G." "Okay," Lacey chuckled as she put her hands in the air to applaud. "Let's all give Tracy a warm welcome." The crowd roared while little Tracy slowly cleared her throat. "Twinkle, twinkle, little G, yes sir, just stirred ABCs." The crowd's mouths dropped as they reacted to the girl's singing voice. "Why go up, avert your eyes," she continued. "What's worth diamonds more than mine?" Some in the audience sighed in approval, still holding their applause for the end. "No one's song can speak for me," she continued, "as it bound reality." "Ah," said most of the audience along with Lacey. "Thanks," little Tracy spoke modestly before taking from the stage to the seating near Lacey. It was themed for the Lacey Goldman show to open with a stage act, and common for that act to be a youth performing a special skill. Tracy was particularly young, but not the youngest to ever have performed. Jen's own mouth slightly hanging open for a moment, she jumped up and rushed back for her notes, partially listening as Miss Goldman's show began. "Where did that come from?" Lacey was saying, partially to the giggling of some of the crowd. Jen finally found her notes again and made her way to laying them out onto the breakfast table. "Yes, sir, just stirred," she mumbled. "Yes, sir, just stirred. Yes, sir, just stirred. Yes, sir. Ha!" She had her hands slammed on the table and pressed as if ready to be patted down in a prisoner's lineup, although it was her note that held her in captivity for the present moment. She found what she was looking for and read it slowly, dropping against the furniture and stiffly. Thump. "The ABCs," she grunted. "She sang the tune I was going to sing to, and yes, sir, these are just too many things all adding up to be coincidences." She wrote some more. "Yes, sir, I never knew. This feeling couldn't be from you, or anybody, even me. There's got to be a reason, please, to stumble on this method to have written something also new. I've learned to dream the words to say and make it to the stage someday, but as and to for whom?" Chapter 5. 9 days later, Jen was in an argument with her manager at the job. They had been arguing about her lateness in the past couple of weeks, and a slew of other things involving her lately being easily distracted as well as constant trips to the break room. "You've been more than 15 minutes late 5 times in the last 2 weeks, Jen," her manager spoke sternly. "What would you do in my position?" "I'm putting in the work," she answered. "I'm staying the extra time." "You're not staying the extra time for all the time I've caught you in the break room," her manager continued. "Besides that, you're not putting in the right kind of work either, constantly distracted it seems." "I haven't been," Jen started to shout before being interrupted. Calm down, Jen. Some fellow coworkers were now paying attention to the back hall, some peeking to see into what all of the fuss would finally settle. Jen just groaned. It's a bad kind of stress put on us as a business, her manager continued. I have to let you go. Things slammed home for Jen, realizing she'd been practicing so far ahead for her fames and fortunes, she indeed hadn't really been paying enough attention day to day at the job. When she finally spoke again, her manager was flabbergasted. I don't need this job in the long run anyway. I'll just find another short-term one somewhere else. Steve waited patiently for the moment to make sure she was done and then told her straightforwardly, please just go home. Fired over the damn alphabet, Jen muttered as she stomped her way to her locker. What's, he echoed through the hallway to her. That's supposed to mean? Nothing, Jen muttered, flipping him the bird on her way out the back door. I plan on getting my act together is all. Chapter 6. By the time Jen had made it home from what was apparently her last day of the job, at the only place she had ever called work, she was exhausted. So much so that when the thought of turning on the television came to her mind, she didn't even consider that it might deter her from thinking things through for herself. What she really could have used was some sleep. She had purchased a dream journal on the way home, considering that she might not have much money for a while, and filled it with only 2 entries, neither of which was related to any of her recent dreams. Her first entry had been her list of original songs over the week and a half since that dream, the ones that she had been writing and specific appearances they might have had in all sorts of programs and promotional ads on the television, however partial or elusive. Her second entry had been a log of all the guests on the Lacey Goldman show from the week, with the alphabet performer deliberately circled for the unusual performance timing and coincidence with the start of things for her. She didn't know it yet, but this was quite obviously the start of quite a breakdown from reality. She read over her second entry once again, trying to make a connection between what had been talked about from one of the program's particular episodes to the next, particularly the bits about each episode and how they compare alongside the ads she jotted onto the checklist for their own similarities, musically or however else. She hadn't been able to differentiate any specific commercials' influences on the behaviors of each guest as far as what had been promoted during each commercial break, even after the most elaborate and popular ones. But they seemed to play the other way around to what was being discussed on the show. So Jen had been mulling over the possibility that the ads had been being produced all along during the taping of each episode, and that episodes must have actually been done live, regardless of the time zone in which it took place, and admitted that she had absolutely no idea why it would be in prime time for only her time zone, concluding that the creators that be must just tape the basic program hour after hour all day long. This way they would have different versions for each time zone. The more Jen considered the logistics of platforms used for broadcasting television programs, the more she'd find herself jumping to illogical conclusions until finally settling on working fake logic out of the most elaborate of delusions. By the end, she was certain that any companies responsible for the television promotions and for the actual programs alike must have been included in the invention of some grand algorithm-based filter meant to customize experience, which made it fairly easy to relate directly with any given viewer, and that she had somehow become intertwined with that algorithm in the grand scheme of the dimensions she lived in. In short, she had gone completely insane. Her delusions of grandeur finally focused around her own egocentricity, and she didn't even realize that she was slipping farther and farther from her turn. Her delusions were indeed set, and there was nothing anybody could have done to prevent it, it would seem. She was beginning to think, for instance, that the set designs for promotions amongst each studio lot coordinated with the story within each promotion because of the basic locations simply being littered with products and props so that anything could be incorporated into 15-second productions. This was just in case the correlating programs had happened to mention any of those products on a different cue. While her heart was in the right place, trying to make it all logical, it simply was not logical. Chapter 7. Since being fired from her job, every public service promotion she would see seemed to be about unemployment status, and frankly, she hoped that her mother would know how to help her get her job back. Jen could always rely on her mother with situations like these. Not the insomnia and other byproducts of a racing mind, but at least with getting her old job back. Her mother could at least explain the things which Jen had not been given the chance to explain, perhaps. Her thoughts seemed to line up and sometimes even cultivate with the television as it being heard and reacted, but not responded to. But she would sometimes listen to the radio for ideas while writing as well, which seemed almost to respond a bit more accurately. She knew it was no time to write just as it was no time to sulk, but the radio might help her from the words necessary to tell her mother what had happened, and the conversation might help also. But she felt an introduction would need to be written prior. For all the times that she listened to the radio simultaneously while writing things, this time it seemed as if everything she wrote was being said on it within only 1 or 2 seconds, as if somebody was reading over her shoulder and telling her where she'd made a misspelling or where she could have used a better word or other things the like. Sometimes she would even hear exactly what had been written, followed by the question of where on earth she's planning for the song to go, having not yet written the next line. The noise of the radio had soon become worse than the music that tried to pass through it, only reminding her that if not for what had happened at work, she could be writing comfortably right now, and without this pesky task at hand. Regardless, she had to write a sort of explanation for her mom. She flipped at the dial again and again, frantically trying to get away from fake anti-disestablishment radio, only to find more and more fake anti-disestablishment. She couldn't take it anymore, and so she simply spun the dial to random static, frantically searching the desk for her pen again. She made sure to carry it around the room with her any time she moved, and it turned out to be in her hand when she finally found it. She went to the dinner table, where she had all of her writings, littered with the notepads she had found before purchasing her proper journal, which was neatly in the middle, atop the shuffled clutter. "Mom," she wrote, "I've been having trouble lately trying to sleep, and it just cost me my job today." She wrote quickly and scratching out the part about having trouble trying to sleep. That's when a song from the static peeked through. "We've all been sleeping through our lives," it was singing. Jen decided it'd be easier if she wrote out her explanation just a bit more poetically, planning to play what she'd say by ear once her mother was actually on the phone. She tried again to write something on the romantic side while remaining still clearly logical, and so only the romantic came to her. She had been awake practically the whole week, napping for the occasional hour. "I've been sleeping through my life," she wrote, "and it seems as though nobody understands that when somebody's been opening their eyes to new opportunities, while that person needs their life to continue throughout those opportunities landing. Before they do, to make their transitions possible. I've been writing poetry about this dream I've had, and it seems right along with what's already been put out there. Doesn't that mean that I'm as good as anybody that's already made it? So then, what's been holding me back? I can't sleep and I lost my job today because the boss probably noticed my poor condition. That's not so bad, is it?" She finally drew the pen away, deciding that she might be better off not to elaborate much more. Although the whole thing seemed romantic to her, it was actually quite ambiguous and didn't even speak all of the issues honestly. It was all truth, though, even if it wasn't all of the truth. And it was finally time for her to pick up the phone and just call her mother. "Mom," she said as soon as the telephone on the other end clicked off the ringer. "Hello?" responded Jen's mother. "Mom," Jen repeated. "Hello, Jen?" her mother asked. What are you doing?" Jen didn't explain that what she was about to say had been planned, but rather decided to just read the whole thing. When she had completely finished, her mother finally spoke. "I don't think you sound very prepared for what you're saying." "I actually," explained Jen, "had to write it down first so that I'd remember what I wanted to have said." "What are you trying to tell me? Is it something that you want to talk about?" "It just comes out a little..." "Mom," Jen started, "weren't you listening? You kind of took me off guard." "You lost your job because you've been fantasizing and losing sleep?" "That's," Jen eventually muttered, "about the gist of it." "What are you trying to tell me here, Jen? You need rent money now? Because we've been over this before." "Well," Jen said sternly, "it'd be nice, but I doubt you're going to change your mind about helping me out with any of that." "Jen," her mother began, "are you okay? You sound..." "Mom," Jen interrupted, "it isn't a big deal for me to find another job, but that's not what I'm telling you. What I'm trying to tell you is I'm going to publish my poetry, Mom. It's already practically the same as the stuff they play on TV and radio, and so..." Jen," her mother said, "I'm coming over." "You're not getting it. You gotta listen to what I'm trying to say. It was hard enough to sleep the last week, so I couldn't really write it out so well, maybe. But I'm trying at least." "You haven't slept for a week?" her mother exclaimed. "Jen?" "Mom..." "I'm coming over there to check on you," her mother commanded. "Mom, don't come here," Jen hollered, but her mother had already hung up the phone on the other end. Everything seemed to be telling her that she was right and to be confident, and that from every angle she looked at it, from what her mother had assumed, other people simply weren't going to understand it either, unless she somehow wrote it out properly. She worried about this, pacing her floor for an hour and trying to collect her thoughts, until there was a hard pound on the door. The pound seemed to coincide with her finally being ready to go somewhere, anywhere. And when she opened the door, praying that it was anybody but her mother, something else deep inside her made her want to hide whom she was. That's what scared her most, and for a long time she would be guarded about these feelings for her mother having come for her that day. Chapter 8. "Come on, what the hell?" started Jen. She was staring 3 police officers in the face outside her doorway. The first one spoke. "Okay, just calm down," he said. "Are you Jen?" "Yeah," she said. "My mom called you, I take it." "We just come to check on you and talk a little bit," the first officer continued. "Your mom says you haven't really been sleeping, is that right?" He peeked into her apartment to see that it was a mess. Over the past couple weeks, the laundry had piled up on the floor and the dishes in the sink. The table was still littered with scribbled poetry. "Do you mind if we come in?" "Actually, I'm sort of busy right now. This will only take a minute," the second officer assured her as he practically welcomed himself into her home. "There's nothing to talk about," Jen answered, letting him through. "My mother worries about every little thing. Would you like to just come with us down to the intervention center so we can straighten things out with her then?" spoke the first officer discerningly. Jen didn't know what the intervention center was or what it was going to be like, but she imagined restraints. All she knew is she didn't want to go, and she terribly regretted even trying to open up to her mom. Her mother had mentioned the intervention center before once when Jen had been caught smoking marijuana at 15, and this time she didn't think she'd have much better experience explaining things than she had back then. Once someone had in their mind that someone was thinking awry, nothing the person could say would ever really settle the matter. And now she thought to herself that she might as well exercise her right not to do or say anything. "Take her," one of the officers' radios spoke, as if ignoring Jen's thoughts that she might be left in peace. to intervention and have her drug tested. Copy, the officer responded. You seem confused and disoriented, so we're going to take you to have you tested for any drugs that might be in your system, okay? What? Jen became distraught immediately. They couldn't do that, could they? The officers began to surround her, and one reached for his handcuffs. I'm not confused. Her arms were suddenly behind her back, although not taken by the officers, and she was turning around in compliance, not sure exactly why. She'd just seen in movies when people resist this sort of thing, and it usually wound up the same situation anyway. I don't have any drugs in my system. The officers complied and handcuffed her arms. We're not arresting you, just calm down, said the acting officer. We're just going to take you somewhere you might feel more comfortable talking. The other officers nodded along, and one added, where you can get some rest maybe. When they began to guide her away, she held tight. I'll sleep, she pleaded. Here, just let me stay here and I'll lay down. It's just been a rough week, that's... The three of them lifted her into the air and carried her out of the apartment, struggling. Outside the building, there was an ambulance waiting. They hoisted her onto a gurney, and the ambulance orderlies strapped her in, as ambulance orderlies do. She spent a good hour inside as she was being driven to the Urban Psychiatric Intervention Center, and after peeing in their cup, she waited until the middle of the night before the center psychiatrist would even see her to speak. Chapter 9. Would you ever harm yourself or others? Asked the psychiatrist. Jen just remained silent, shaking her head in impatience. Have you ever considered suicide? Still silent, this time Jen rolled her eyes impatiently. Are you hearing any voices? This broke Jen's patience, and she turned sternly toward the psychiatrist. You're almost done, he said. Have you ever received any transmissions from the TV or radio or another device? Jen broke down, putting her hands to her forehead and covering her eyes tightly with her palms. You wouldn't believe it, she exclaimed. Nobody would. They make sure of that. Everybody gets their own experience from the media, and people will tell you that, but they won't acknowledge how literal the statement really is. Started the doctor. I'm going to have you recommended for treatment somewhere you can be better diagnosed. You're displaying plenty of symptoms of grand delusions. I came here to test for drugs, Jen spoke. Did you find any or what? Should we have? Asked the psychiatrist curiously. Leave me alone and just let me go. This isn't right. You can stay the night here, but if you're not going to be compliant, then you can wait in the waiting room for your transfer with the others. I suggest you get some sleep. We have a bed available for you. Jen threw her head back and clasped the armrest of her chair she sat in near the desk so tightly that it hurt her hands. She did this until some orderlies came in and had to break her clasp, hoisting her from the chair, then carrying her back into the lobby. The chairs in the lobby were even more stiff and uncomfortable than the restraints gurney had been in the ambulance. People were arguing on the television about which child was whose. The people at the desk were laughing at videos on their phones, and every so often an EMT group would come to collect one of the other captives. She'd arrived at midday and been waiting all night for her own transfer before it finally came. It was 6:30 in the morning, and Jen couldn't have possibly slept in those chairs, so she had simply been staring at the floor the entire night, and the food they had brought her was hardly appetizing. So when her EMT group finally arrived, she was hallucinating lines of colors and waves coming up from the floor and hearing shouts from the sleeping area she'd been offered. Nonetheless, she was very relieved to finally be taken away from that terrible place. The shouts, becoming unbearable, mostly were about not belonging or about having prior appointments elsewhere. One particular voice kept shouting over and over that life wasn't meant to be spent trapped. It shouted that judging eyes belong on the self and the self alone. The shouting had been so bad that Jen had wondered to herself if the definition of compliance among these people should be reconsidered, since she'd sat quietly to herself the whole night, not bothering anybody. At that thought, the EMT group burst through the doors for her, announcing loudly, Jennifer Hastings? The one announced. There were only two of them, who could have been brother and sister in their resemblance. They were not only the same build and hair type, they even sounded the same. Jen noticed this when the woman spoke. Jen? Come along, the man then followed. We're going to take you somewhere better. The second EMT took her by the arm, strapping it to another gurney they'd rolled alongside them as they approached her. You sure are a skinny one, the woman EMT said calmly. All right, give me the other arm. Jen was much more compliant with this woman until seeing her mother waiting outside the door by the flashing lights. She pulled her arm away, and it had to be pulled back toward the gurney, close enough to be fit into the restraints. Once both arms were strapped, Jen had to accommodate the strain on her back by climbing up backwards onto the bedding. Okay, the woman EMT told her. It's going to be okay. We're going to strap your feet now. The male EMT spoke into his radio with a little bit of a glow. She's coming out, he said. Is the mother outside? Yeah, the female EMT said quickly, turning. Her ponytail almost smacked Jen right in the face. Careful, Jen snapped. You're okay, sweetie, the female EMT replied quickly, turning. Mama's not going to hurt you. Mom? Jen asked, staring into the concerned eyes of the female EMT. She's confused, the male EMT said into the radio. Confused, the word had new meaning now. Could one person actually embody multiple personalities, as they seemed to think she was seeing her mother in this woman? Maybe for all she knew, she was delusional and saw people entwined with other appearances all along. Did the CMT perhaps have a fusion of identity which simply offended her being called upon, even if by mistake? Maybe it was a grown-up thing to know that sort of logic, and Jen just simply had never learned it before today. Then there was the question, maybe she didn't know as well for her own benefit as the authorities of the whole ordeal. Then again, she'd gone through a fairly traumatic night these past 15 hours, and all these maybes flooding her mind at once made her decide that this EMT woman was indeed her mother, in some parallel reality, in a younger version. Although she remembered, her mother was standing to the side of the ambulance, back behind the orderlies. This made Jennifer change her mind radically to think maybe the EMT was her own self, and that everybody in the world has this sort of doppelganger who only comes out if an intervention is necessary. Could this be the crisis in her life which brought out her personal self for Haven? Was she going to help her understand and better explain the way that the radio had been speaking and narrating Jen's environment and writings? It was also a possibility that perhaps these people were all in cahoots with her mother against her, and trying to bring her up to speed of the way media had been all her life, and help her understand that she just recently started to come to grips with such a new reality. Maybe they were going to try and help her after all. She was hoisted into the ambulance as her pale mother stared off weeping into some general direction afar, appearing to have also been up all night, appearing to be of the zombie nature. But as Jen reached her hand in the air to wave a sympathetic gesture, the restraint locked itself into a tighter fasten. The woman EMT reached her own hand forward and accustomed the straps. Her mother waved her own hand forward toward Jen, simultaneously grunting with the woman EMT, only her mother's grunt was of a blubber through the tears. When the man EMT slammed the doors of the transfer ambulance, the visual noise of flashing sirens disappeared, or at least shrank into the windows in the front cab, which was behind Jen, and therefore a soft sort of visual she could sense but couldn't actually see. The man EMT then made his way to the passenger seat while the woman EMT climbed into the driver's seat. Mom? Jen said again. We'll be there shortly, honey, said the woman EMT, shifting into gear as she pressed on the radio. En route, she spoke. The radio muffled out some scrambled static from a voice that sounded familiarly as Lacey Goldman. and kept repeating the same scrambled words periodically through static over the course of the drive. "She's going to learn how to control her confusion," Jen would hear. "She's going to learn her confusion." She was, in truth, dozing off to sleep and wouldn't wake until their arrivals to the psychiatrical ward of a nearby hospital. Chapter 10. The first person Jen noticed at the hospital was one working at the desk. For something she couldn't put her finger quite on, this woman stood out from anybody else. Perhaps it was just a different setting she'd never been in, but there was simply something different there from anyone Jen had ever set eyes on. The woman had long, thick blonde hair, wavy and past her shoulders, and the build of somebody that had been carrying burdens for some time, although she wasn't a nervous wreck like most of the orderlies around, nor the technicians who were wheeling computers about the halls of the floor. The woman stepped out from behind the desk and wrapped a pressure monitor around Jen's arm after the sensory inspection which had taken place in the elevator, with flashing lights in her eyes by the EMTs who'd taken Jen by wheelchair to that floor of this particular hospital. It was all very wearing on her, what with the flashlight in her eyes and the taps at her elbows and knees. So when the woman finally spoke, as calmly as she did, it seemed to have a certain blush, meeting one very concerned expression in a nice change of pace from the callous others. That terrible, now going on nearly 20 hours of suspicions from the others. The woman's eyes glowed, and she turned as somebody called her name. "Jessica," one of the other technicians was calling from the desk. Jen ducked her head a bit to glance unnoticeably to the woman's name tag, which indeed read Jessica. It's a good thing she ducked, too, because as Jessica turned her head around toward the desk, her hair flung just over Jen's. Had Jen not ducked, it would have whipped her smack in the face, and that's when the idea was staring back at her again. How did the EMT change so quickly into an orderly? Now, Jen turned toward the elevator that had taken her. Had Jessica been the name of the woman EMT that slightly resembled her mother, and now this orderly? The elevator doors were just closing out of time for Jen to see if the EMT driver was still present inside. She wished she'd taken a glance at the EMT's name tags, just in case. Who was this changing soul trying to help her? Nothing was adding up to Jen, and in a sudden instant she felt faint. The apparatus around her arm loosened, and she picked her head up, which had begun to fall. "I'm Jessica," the woman spoke softly. "I'm going to be taking your pressure each day. We're a team, you and me, and we both need to make sure the other is doing their job, okay?" "I'm tired," Jen managed. "Well then," Jessica replied, "that's a good sign for now. I'll show you to your room just as soon as we finish checking your vitals, okay?" "Okay," Jen agreed. It made sense to her that whoever this Jessica was, she was at least caring and spoke gently. Jen hadn't been concerned for herself these ways, in what seemed like forever, checking her weight and breathing deeply and exercise as she was. "How long have you been here?" "Oh, I've been here a while," Jessica assured Jen. "It seems like I've always been looking out for people. But remember to believe me when I say it, these things take teamwork." "How'd you get here so fast?" Jen dared. "Try and put yourself in my shoes," she started. "If I'm to understand how you're feeling, I need to put myself in yours, and in your current condition, that might make me a little questionable. Am I right?" "Do you know what I mean?" "We might lose perspective," Jen guessed. "Is that it?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Jessica smiled while patting Jen on the knee and checking a few more things off the clipboard, which had suddenly made itself to her hands. Jen was trying not to make sense of sudden changes in her environment, at least not right so all at once. "Are you ready to see your new bed and roommate now?" Jessica added. Chapter 11. Jen didn't even have an assigned roommate yet. She got a whole room all to herself. She slept for the next 14 hours, awaking and not knowing what day it was. She supposed it didn't much matter since there was nothing of the outside world to worry about as long as she was confined. She stepped out of her room, ready to find Jessica and ask how things were supposed to work in such captivity. Besides all that, Jen had been on the verge of a freak-out the whole night prior, having been restrained for as long as she had, and not able to sleep. This was her first time in a hospital, and she was simply there because of her misunderstanding with her mother, wherein she really had thought she should have met with slightly better understandings. It made perfect sense to Jen that she should be completely compliant now that she was fully rested as well as fully confined. But Jessica wasn't at the desk anymore, so Jen searched the floor and couldn't find her at the vital station or in any of the recreation rooms. Jen began to worry that Jessica had left her to this place, and after that whole speech about being a team, she glanced down one side of the hall, then another. Having returned to the center of the board, some grouchy voice from the desk screeched at her. Excuse me, it spoke. Do you know where you're supposed to be? The harsh, raspy voice made Jen turn back abruptly and pretty well startled. No, she replied, I really don't. There, the grouchy technician screeched in the same raspy voice, while pointing with his pen to the dry erase board on the wall, on it names written in colored markers. There were 2 colors, and Jen searched for her name on either side but couldn't find it. Just then she heard Jessica grunt a peppy grunt, which sounded like a squeak from all the way at the other end of the hall, the side of the hall where Jen's room was. Teamwork, she was saying. Only this time she was dressed in a gray janitor's uniform. All Jen could see once the voice was fully echoed to her was Jessica's ponytail whipping behind the gray outfit, as the opening door took the tail with it into the stairwell, with the mop and its bucket dragging behind her. Jen's compliance went straight with the ponytail, and she started inching that direction. No, 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 snapped the grouchy voice from the desk. The stairwell door slammed shut, while at the same time the technician slammed open the swinging door from behind the desk. The screech raced around to Jen as he stepped in front of her, to point to the dry erase board sternly. Right there on the board. Do you see your name? No, pleaded Jen. It's not on there, not anywhere. She glanced back down the hallway, but nothing. There's nothing that way, snapped the newer technician. What's your name? He pointed again vaguely to the board. I'm Jen. But there wasn't a spot with that on there. Jen, the technician began, writing a name down at the bottom of the list, an empty spot correlating with top column title of group therapy. He then spoke again harshly as ever. There, you're supposed to be in group therapy sessions already. Chapter 12. Predestined, Jen thought to herself. That's what this all seemed like to her. No, she thought back, not simply predestined. Predetermined was the word for this. Of course, her sanity might have been lost, not knowing what to call reality anymore. Her grips of her understanding sinking down in the window right along with the sun, outside the discussion room where she was supposed to be speaking once her turn came. Everything was predetermined in this mess of situation, such as what she was supposed to confess about herself. She knew she was expected to admit what she understands to be crazy thoughts in her head, and that she wants just to return to normal reality. But she didn't know how to do any of that. Who, after all, was to decide what sanity really is? These people? Most of them were talking about high anxiety and problems with anger. How could they decide? The head of the discussion was a counselor, and he was the one predetermining what these people should be talking about, almost stirring the anxiety and anger. Her turn to speak would certainly turn heads if she told everyone that media has a way of knowing what they're doing and saying at home. She knew by this point that at the very least, about that kind of talk, nobody was ready to hear those ideas. These groups weren't for her. Had the media truly been watching her over her entire life just for inspiration, she should certainly share it. But if it had been taking her ideas without her even knowing herself, how could she expect anyone else to understand? It was injustice, though, she decided, that if she could hear her own words and see the mouths of people on the television speaking them, then what if her senses were left to depend on anyways? The tall, slender group counselor gently took to his clipboard with some notes, and then glanced into his accordion-style briefcase, before calling for her to share. "Jennifer," he beckoned, "is there anything you'd like to share? Goals, perhaps?" Jen couldn't think of any goals she could set for herself, since she was speaking with someone in the business of predetermining failures from weaknesses. The only goal that came to her mind was maybe to finally admit the possibility that she had truly lost her marbles. But she was afraid of the scrutiny attached to doing something like that. "Sorry," she emphasized, "I really don't know. Charles was wondering if anybody had any ideas for support with his sleep disorder," explained the counselor. "If you'd like us to skip you, we can go around and come back." No, Jen stammered, glancing at the counselor's name tag, which read Glenn. And then she spoke again. Then it came to her. They'd all buy it. Hell, it might even help. Try singing the alphabet song when you're going to bed. The whole group giggled, except for Charles and Glenn, the counselor. "That's not," Glenn replied. "His narcolepsy causes him to fall asleep uncontrollably, and when he's stressed. Please pay more attention." "Oh," Jen shouted, angered at the realization that, although it was her turn to finally speak, she wasn't asked about herself. "Maybe we'll just skip you," said Glenn, "unless you have any of your own goals set for when you get out of here." "Oh," Jen began, "goals, yeah. I thought I'd work on my writing while I was in here so I have material when I get out, and it won't be like I missed so much time. I'm sure doctors like knowing that we're making most of our time, right?" "Actually," Glenn said softly, "part of the reason you're here is because your room was riddled with clutter, most of which were scribbles on notepads overflowing from your table, brought to us courtesy of your mother, which none of us can make any sense of, not even her." The group sighed together in that moment. "But," started Jen, "I didn't have any time to organize it all until I lost my job, and then I got taken from it and landed in here, so..." "Yeah, we know," the counselor told her. "Instead of organizing, you called your mom to complain about your job, and..." "I didn't even tell her what I've been writing," Jen pleaded. "How, you went through my apartment?" "Why does anybody write?" Glenn continued. "Isn't it to be heard?" "But no, you don't understand," Jen tried to explain. "My writing had already gone places before I had the opportunity to show anyone, really. People were beginning to depend on it, and..." "Jen," Glenn consoled to Jen, "nobody's depending on you to write here, okay?" "That's not what I mean," Jen grunted. "It goes places. It goes to places, not just where I write them." "Where's your writing going to go without you?" he asked gently. "I don't know," Jen complained, "how it happens, but maybe the universe is all connected or something, and they have some way of picking up on things I'm writing, but I know they wanted more." "So you want to write while you're in here," Glenn concluded. "Can we also write that you plan to be compliant with the doctors while you're with us?" "Sure, fine," Jen pouted. "Who's next?" Chapter 13. Jen had been in the hospital for almost an entire week, and she was starting to make use of her time when allowed the opportunity to sing along with the songs on the radio, if and whenever they let her into the recreation room. She exercised her time in group, complaining about people like her mother not understanding that dragging her from her normal routine wasn't going to stop her from a new career in writing songs, whether even if other people were going to sing them for radio or if she eventually would. She didn't quite have that part figured yet out for herself, but no matter how crazy the inspirations may seem, she was determined. The doctors didn't really know what to make of her claims until their specialist came to visit. What are your hopes and dreams? The doctor asked Jen behind the closed door to the office. I want to be a singer on the stage, Jen began, but I'd settle for just writing songs for others, I guess, too. The doctor stopped himself. You want to do music? Yeah, Jen confirmed, a little annoyed that he demanded it from her. I don't want to be just any singer, though. I thought I'd do something that's never been done before, making some sort of an art out of unorthodox performances, you know? Well, surely you have something in mind for yourself, he agreed. He was the first of anyone in this hospital to show much confidence in her aspirations. The group counselor tried steering her at any mention of them to talk more about day-to-day grooming and hygiene, as well as cleanliness for her environment. They seemed as well to frown on the idea that she could become, let alone already be, a famous figure in the writing world of music. In a place like this, she explained further, all I can see is that the people I'm identifying with aren't fellow patients, but the staff rather, and the staff seems to be people already successful in what they do in the same ways I want to be. She waited for a nod to make sure he was listening before finishing her thought. If I see it like I'm not yet where I want to be, then how am I supposed to ever find the ambition to jump the level of succession? There's no jumping levels, the specialist commanded. It takes hard work and dedication. But it can take jumping levels, Jen pressed, if you see successful sorts of feelings as something you can already identify with. It takes the understanding that you can be successful, and regardless if it's true, shouldn't already believing in your own success find you past that gap of not being so? It also, the doctor continued, only partially following her train of thought though, takes quite a bit of luck for most people in the entertainment business. I can't just rely on luck though. It's only going to come to me if I allow more than the possibility of luck. Don't you understand? Of course, he agreed slightly. There's the fact that you need to be hard-driven. Jen finally sat back as the doctor checked off her file on his clipboard. You seem to have a slightly healthy start on what you want to do, and I hope you find a healthy way to get there as well. I'll be back next week to talk some more. A week? Jen complained, scanning out the window of the office to see Jessica pushing a computer on wheels. She jumped nearly out of her seat, realizing that she was going to need to be polite with these people, and calmed her voice. That's it then for now? For now, the specialist smiled. Chapter 14. Teamwork, Jen called down the hall to where Jessica was checking each patient's vitals the following morning. She didn't want to miss her chance in case Jessica was headed toward the secret escape door again. Jenny committed her mind to the belief that it was indeed Jessica who disguised herself as the janitor each day. Since they both seemed to vanish around the same time, the janitor would take her dust broom to the halls before leaving through the same stairwell each time. Jessica turned quick, her ponytail snapping in the air like a bullwhip to her gleeful enunciation as Jen approached. Are you settling in nicely? She asked. I need to ask you some questions that are going to sound crazy at first, Jen explained, and they probably are. We're here to listen, Jessica assured. Jen explained her situation entirely, beginning with her worries and concerns that Jessica was working multiple jobs for the team's benefit and finishing with her approval for such behavior, only to discover just how crazy it was making her seem. In the middle of her ramblings, however, she did manage to describe what she had discovered about the voices she heard from radio and television, so she finally concluded with her question. If someone's trying to keep a secret from people and another person discovers it, should they make the secret keepers aware that they'll be telling people of their suspicions? There aren't any secrets here, Jessica explained, to begin with. But if you truly still wonder about that sort of thing, perhaps you're benefiting from the idea that you do have a true team from all of us who are here to help. And maybe your suspicions that one person like me would be doing multiple facets of the job in disguise, then maybe it means you have more people in the world that you know who want to see you succeed. She went on to explain that she's seen quite many patients come through with infatuations for the staff or fellow patients, perhaps just for some normalcies of conversation, and that it was common for people to shrug off their supporters out in the world in a place where they only really have the staff to rely on for that. I do feel, Jen proudly responded, like there are people out there who support me. I just don't know if I can ever get out there and meet them someday. That's something that you should talk with your therapist about. But there's one thing to consider as well, Jessica suggested. What's that? Jen asked after a slight hesitation. Do you remember calling me Mom when we first met? Jen didn't know what to say to this. She was taken aback, and then Jessica said something that really hit her hard. You've been talking about her to everybody in the very first groups you've attended as well, but I don't think it's because she sent the police to have you taken away or anything. Did it occur to you that you have a team out there working with you that you already are close with? Chapter 15. It had been nearly 3 weeks that Jen spent in the ward before she had finally been released. Her final bow was to Jessica when she came around again, whom she passed a small note that she had scribbled from her craft and workshop group activity. The note explained that she still believed everybody had been living coupled personalities, but that she herself could only really manage to identify outwardly to one at a time, and that may be why she projects her own beliefs to the world, as if the world should already know the thing that she herself has been thinking to say. She had truly gotten so bad in her delusions that way that she was still trying to rationalize them in order to cope, but the doctors had to release her by law after a certain amount of time when attorneys from the state came to argue how well she'd progressed after that time period in captivity. But while she was still not fully aware of her own condition, she had the impression that if she could rationalize how to speak ethically and with better etiquette about things she believed, then she might buy some time for herself without being sent back there again. She figured this would at least allow her to do some of her own tests against what the radio and television might say after having written the things she would come to write. In other words, Jen was released while trying to better herself by way of her dreams, and regardless of her belief that it was because of her destiny demanding it for her to do so. She knew she was destined to experience the settings she fantasized for herself, no matter how much of a stretch, and figured the best way to do so would be to act as if she was already living those fantasies, no matter what environments or surroundings she identified with in the realities of the situation. It was a sort of mental repression she feared, which was keeping her from actualizing her own success, and it was diagnosed as her strongest delusion. As such, she was assigned to see a therapist for follow-up outpatient care, but in no way did she truly believe that delusions became of what everybody saw in her afterwards, despite the strong feeling that people would wonder to each other aloud about her when she finally was allowed to return to her job. Jen was of course still very mixed up, but at least she could admit that she was confused and trying eventually to bring herself to explain some of the confusions to her mother in more proper and eventual ways. She had also always made friends nicely enough with the people around her, which helped when she found a common cafe around the corner to frequent and to people watch, at the very least, to fill her time instead of constantly being swept into what the media was saying whenever she'd synchronize her writing to it. She was also even polite with her doctors, even though she was pretty well embarrassed for their asking questions, even if they were just going to call the answers to them delusional. She knew, however, that there was nothing wrong with being checked for health at the mental capacities of it, and spoke to their questions honestly and openly, just the same. She didn't think she could be overly polite simply nodding and agreeing along at the group sessions they suggested for her either, and even considered she may make a few friends from them too. Acknowledging what she knew to be her own egocentricity for not knowing how to be better with others was actually quite the big step in her recovery after all, as she noticed in most of the other people's own recoveries. And it also made her feel less alone in the whole panic of the matter. So she thought to herself for the longest time that simply being genuinely polite, she might one day simply wake from the reality in which she wasn't right about, and to the one she thought she would one day wake to and be successful at. This thought kept her confident when she spoke with her doctors openly and honestly, and mostly because the ends in both cases would justify the means. She was being polite and might one day awaken. The real step forward was when she decided that rather than depending on some stroke of luck like in the magic, which she felt was within her writings, she would put aside the idea that her fantasy could be some sort of backup plan and truly started to work toward her dream of being the performer on stage. She would join other performers where welcome to do so and recite her lyrics, and would even ask some of the musicians if they wanted to play behind her as she sang them, which sometimes actually worked out nicely for the occasion. She knew that she would have to work diligently toward her trade, and so she did, and she finally admitted to herself the possibility that she was indeed bananas crazy, but that her delusions were that which kept her in the reality she had to face of it, not being the celebrity she wished and thought herself to be in some parallel to what she could perceive. She did, however, come to adjust her beliefs so that she considered she was living the life she expected for herself, and therefore had to go out and make her dreams come true out in the world before she could actualize the responses back from it. She set goals, therefore, toward the experiences which she could actualize as they happened, and decided to work toward her profession and the considerations that she could set that perhaps success was actually just surpassing the bar set for oneself, and that if there would be a moment she'd awaken to her dreams for a career, she wouldn't even realize it in that moment, maybe. Having made it all happen by going out and doing things toward meeting her vision for herself, she might not even have all of that in mind at the moment of succession. Chapter 16. Having thought she'd seen Jessica several times out of the corner of her eye, ponytail whipping, and hearing Jessica's voice as well in the distance when she turned out not to be, Jen began to contemplate the existence of others. Of course, it would be entirely improper to suggest somebody in her dream reality that the figure was a dream. What demon might come out of the self-aware demon was not quite the desired inquiry either anyways. And so Jen conceded to discuss the possibility with the next person she met that the other was the real one, and that she herself might be the dream. Indeed, it was what she believed principally, and it wouldn't insult anybody's egos. She answered the door to Janice, who was to be her peer counselor at home. Janice was there in the doorway when Jen opened to her warmly. "I've been sent," Janice told Jen warmly, "by the outpatient program to make sure you're getting on okay in your home. May I come in?" "I was expecting you," Jen said nicely. It was easy to be polite when considering that this person was only her true self trying to discover her own dreams, as Jen saw things how they might work. This was where her next delusions had taken since leaving the hospital. Although she decided to not only share them with professionals from now on. She figured, though, that the people she saw imagining her into existence would explain people's behaviors in awareness of the surroundings she would simply have to grow accustomed to. Perhaps what they imagined most for her during the lone times was her apartment, and perhaps that's why she was living where she was living, and the same went with the job that they must have imagined for her. It only made sense that a person would be concerned for the well-being of their imagination, and it was quite pleasant indeed to see Janice then and there. "Are you going to be?" Jen gently asked, with her fingers crossed and actually behind her on the other side. "My counselor for a good while?" "Well, I can tell you," Janice explained, "that your living situation is either a satisfactory condition or a non-satisfactory condition, and we'll go from there. I can assure you your comfort is the most important thing to consider, so as long as you're comfortable by talking with someone, and if that helps you live in satisfactory conditions, then yeah. I guess you could say I'll be a counselor of sorts. Do you have any questions before I come in?" "Well," Jen began, before taking a deep breath, "my situation is that everything you see is my accepted style of living, but that I do not believe it to be my truly own self. So if there is anything I can do for anybody that is my true..." She quit explaining abruptly before rephrasing her conflict, though, as she recalled the concern which Jessica had shown with Jen's explanation at the hospital. "Let me put it this way," she started again. "Hypothetically, if I were to choose the model person from whom to base my dreams, my lifestyle would be an impressive one because the role wouldn't be played so messy. And any messiness you might see here is related to my dream state rather than my true identity. Is that going to be okay?" Wait, Janice interrupted, nearly. "Just make sure your sink's not full of dirty dishes and your toilet's flushed, okay?" She knew that she should be paying some certain understanding to the candor of this vulnerability in Jen, so asked for more clarity. "Could you say that all again now?" "Okay," Jen noted, "and thank you for understanding. I guess a way to describe it is that unlike night terrors, which I looked up and I may seem to be describing, I'm actually trying to tell you that my actual psyche doesn't register the atmosphere I live in here as you see it. I'm pretty sure I'd only really feel something is questionable, but if the sort of hiding spot I acknowledge here became compromised." So Janice completed, "You and I are left with two options. I could check you off as satisfactory in blind belief that you aren't just bluffing me, or you could trust that I'm not the judging type on you for those matters. Maybe we can start with the kitchen." "I'm just saying," Jen admitted as she led Janice to the kitchen, "I've only just met you. So if you could check off the cleanliness factor quickly, however long it takes at each visit, maybe you could spend the extra time discussing my trying to live up to those other marks." "Listen," Janice answered, "if I don't find anything unsatisfactory here, then maybe I'll stay the extra time I can spare each week. But I can't guarantee all the time in the world each visit. They only give us an hour." "That's more than enough time," Jen said gleefully. "And any practice that's good for any start off with my living situation before I try my hands at a career would be also no sweat." Janice replied, "It sounds like you're a very healthy individual to me, and that's not very common for somebody so soon past diagnosis. But I'll be willing to grant you the faith I have in my line of work and the opportunity to show me you can live suitably. Granted that you do. But I'm not exactly clear when you say that you think you're not really living where you're living." From there, the two discussed healthy living to great lengths, and even often existentialism. Jen saw it as a blessing in disguise, and 1 year after first meeting Janice, she prepared the speech which needed to be expressed in all fairness. She had given up on the idea that she was Janice's dream, because Janice was working in the psychological profession, while all of Jen's desires took place in the performing arts. She weighed the likeliness that her true identity was singing and belching for all artistic purposes, wherever it was going to take place, and that she was likely that person's imagination. She was finally beginning to sing very well as belching quite nicely while carrying on throughout the course of her daily living. So the possibility of her true self didn't matter to her in the slightest if it wasn't in her chosen and desired field of work. She didn't so much decide she couldn't identify with Janice. She just decided it wasn't worth the work to actualize this type of counseling herself as a career, and would just as soon actualize herself with desires as they came along with each extra person, until she could find her real self out there among people. She found specific idols in the music world and fed them lines during every performance from in front of the radio or television. She also avidly sought to be part of the performance world as well by continuing to go out to those frequented spots she'd found which allowed her to perform. She knew that many people would one day understand her success story in surpassing her goals for successes which she felt she'd already accomplished, now that she finally knew how to say it about her beliefs. That thought calmed her in moments of overwhelming voices from the media. At least she would one day be recognized in a way she herself could notice, and maybe someone would approach her with some claim to that fame. Who knows, maybe it'd even be someone like Lacey Goldman. In the meanwhile, most often whenever anybody would ask how she was doing, she'd simply chuckle and reply, "Living the dream." The end.